Hello everyone, and thank you for waiting, and welcome to this week's roundtable discussion. I'm Eva Cahill, the Assistant Editor here at Oceanographic, and I'll be hosting today's panel. We use these roundtables to discuss some of the biggest headlines coming out of our newsroom, and so far we've covered a huge range of topics, from marine heatwaves and illegal fishing to Britain's sewage crisis and major conservation wins off the shores of Sussex, all of which are available to stream on our Spotify channel and on demand on our site. But in today's session, we are diving into the topic of deep sea mining, as the 31st International Seabed Authority concluded last month. Deep sea mining is a very contentious topic, and for good reason. On the seafloor lie precious metals and minerals like manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. These took millions of years to form and are now being eyed by corporate companies who argue the minerals are necessary to make batteries needed for the green energy transition. But the very fact that we need these metals is also up for debate, with recent reports suggesting we actually have a large amount of these metals already on land, and suggesting that the nature of retrieving these nodules appears to have adverse impacts on an ecosystem we have very little knowledge of. A recent 5-year study showed that deep-sea habitats were directly disturbed by mining equipment, experiencing a 37% decline in animal numbers and a 32% decline in species diversity. The ISA was established under UNCLOS with a mandate to manage the global ocean floor as a common heritage of mankind. But as delegates gathered to negotiate a commercial mining code, the meeting has exposed a deep fracture between a growing coalition demanding protection and an authority some campaigners say is increasingly beholden to corporate interests. A growing bloc of 46 nations, with Mauritius, Mozambique, and the Republic of the Congo recently joining partners like Malawi, Kenya, and Madagascar, are demanding a moratorium or a precautionary pause, largely because we simply lack the baseline science to open fragile deep ecosystems to industrial exploitation without risking irreversible harm to biodiversity, health, and the ocean. Meanwhile, the industry continues to push forward, backed by an unprecedented move by the US, a non-ISA member attempting to issue its own permits in international waters. The session was further charged by legal drama after a tribunal cleared the ISA to investigate rule breaches by Nuaru Ocean Resources Incorporated, a subsidiary of the metals company. While their exploration contract was extended, delegates warned that bypassing international law seriously undermines the seabed's protected status. And at the same time, debates have flared inside the ISE over corporate influence, particularly as corporate contractors like the metals company seek former observer status while keeping their seats inside the official state delegations. Far from providing us with answers, the 31st meeting has left us with a whole new set of questions. Like, where does corporate interest fit into the ISA's mission? How has this changed over the years? How close to mining could we be? How would this affect our deep ecosystems? And how could the rights of nature movement help us to protect our ocean floor? And finally, also an important question, how do we even mine it in the first place? That was a lot more questions than I remember writing down. And thankfully, we have some excellent guests joining us on the panel to help me tackle them. First up, we have Jessica Battle, Global Lead for WWF's No Deep Seabed Mining Initiative. Jessica has been with the Worldwide Fund for Nature since 2001, working across global marine programs, international ocean governance, and policy management. And she was appointed to lead WWF's Deep Sea Initiative in 2019, where she campaigns for internationally for a global moratorium on deep sea extraction while championing high seas conservation and the implementation of the High Seas Treaty. Thanks for joining us, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Next up, we have Andy Whitmore, Finance Advocacy Officer at the Deep Sea Mining Campaign. Andy brings over 3 decades of expertise tracking global extractive industries and advocating alongside frontline communities, having co-founded the Mine Watch Collective in the late 1980s. He also serves as the co-chair of the London Mining Network, focusing his work on challenging the financial viability, market risks, and corporate narratives driving seabed extraction. It's great to have you with us, Andy.
Yep, thanks very much. Thanks for the invite.
And last but definitely not least, we have Lucy Ward. Lucy trained as a marine biologist and began her career working on habitat restoration solutions and leading legal research teams. At the moment, Lucy leads the Ocean Programme at the Earth Law Centre, where she works to forward ecocentric legal innovations for marine species and ecosystems, ensuring their voices are heard and their inherent rights are recognised in our legal system. Thanks for joining us, Lucy.
Thank you.
Right, I'm super excited to stop talking and to start asking questions and get this discussion going. And as always, anyone who's attending online, please do leave your questions in the right-hand chat bar for any of our panellists, and we'll make sure to get them answered. But to kick things off, before we get into deep sea mining, I thought it'd be really nice to dig into the environment that this practice is set to take, or is supposed to take place in. And I'd like to come to you, Jessica, to paint a picture of what we know about our deep sea ecosystems and how important they are.
Yes, thank you. So we know very little about the deep sea. Every deep dive, we are looking at an area which is, below 200 meters or much, much deeper than that, several thousand meters deep, where light doesn't penetrate, where the environment is very, very different from what we know. Even, if you dive down a few meters under the surface, you will feel pressure. The pressure under several thousand meters of water is tremendous. And so the conditions down there are very different. So animals which live down there, it is only animals, no plants, because there is no light, microbes, bigger animals, etc. They are very adapted to this particular environment, and they are slow growing, and then also for that reason very slow to adapt to any change, because it happens very, very slowly in the deep ocean. And so scientists who go down there with submersibles and equipment to have a look, they inevitably, almost every dive, come up with species that are not described yet by science. And scientists say that probably will take 10 to 15 years to have enough scientific knowledge to really understand what is going on in the deep sea, how the different species interact with each other, how the functioning of the deep sea interacts with climate. And so, yeah, we know very little.
Mm-hmm. And Lucy and Jessica, you're fresh off the bat of coming back from the ISA's assembly. I wondered if we could come to you two to kind of paint a picture of what you saw and what your key takeaways were from the assembly. Maybe we give you a rest, Jessica, and come to you, Lucy, first.
Yeah, well, I mean, so this was our first time attending these sessions. Well, my first time attending these sessions, so I'm sure Jessica has many more insights than I do. But yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was just a really, really interesting learning experience, seeing a lot of quite intense geopolitical kind of tensions being played out on this, what felt like quite a rarefied space. So, I mean, that definitely really struck me. It struck me a lot about kind of how the processes and the negotiations were kind of being used and manipulated a bit by all of the different stakeholders to gain certain outcomes. So it was very interesting watching it all kind of unfold before your eyes in what in real time feels like quite a slow, truncated way of operating, but actually a lot of things happen in very quick succession. So quite a strange environment to be in.
Interesting. And what about you, Jessica? What were your main takeaways?
Yeah, so I have been to the assembly probably 6 or 7 times now, and I can still subscribe to what you say, Lucy. It is a bewildering space to be in. I also participate, as you said before, in the high seas treaty negotiations. Very, very different place, very, very different actors. I think the presence of companies on state delegations make a big difference at the International Seabed Authority. It is allowed. There's no restrictions on that, but that does make a big difference, I think. I think also the kind of deep lack of knowledge about the environment in which deep seabed mining could happen is very prominent in most delegations, because these delegations are made up of lawyers. No offense, Lucy, but that's what it is. And so there's a big role for civil society and also for scientists to play as observers in these meetings, to share this knowledge and also to introduce the broader issues in the debate into the International Seabed Authority. Like, where would minerals come from if we didn't get them from the deep sea? How do we talk about circularity? And many, many other issues, because they do sort of snow in on their processes, and also the way the assembly was chaired, so we have two different meetings, right? We have the councils, which is 38 members, and then we have 35, members, and no, 38 with 35 present this time. And then we have the assembly, which are all the member states of the International Seabed Authority, and actually all the states who have ratified the Law of the Sea Convention. So a few states have not done that, they're not members. And so, but if we focus on assembly, we have, it also depends very much on who is actually the president of the assembly. And this time it was the turn of the Western and European countries group, and they chose a president from the Netherlands. And he had a certain style of chairing the meeting, which I think it directed the meeting in more towards the mining issue and less towards the environmental issues. And also more towards opening the deep sea to mining and getting the regulatory framework done than to looking at other issues around governance that are really important for the International Seabed Authority to work. For example, the states debated what is a legal obligation under the Law of the Sea to conduct a review of the governance of the International Seabed Authority every 5 years. It's only happened once in the 31-year history of the ISA. That debate took 1 hour and 11 minutes, whereas they were waffling about opening statements for over 9 hours. So I think that tells you something.
Yeah, it's really quite an interesting setup. There's a couple questions popping up in the chat, but just before we get to those, I wanted to come to you, Andy, and get your sense. You've been tracking this kind of mining extractive activity for the best part of 3 decades. What is your sense of how those narratives that Jessica were talking about, how have they changed with regards to the ISA, and how have the outcomes of the meetings changed in your opinion?
Sure, okay. I will answer that, but if it's okay, I probably will take the first question that's come up, just because I kind of think it's good also in setting the background.
Yeah.
Because obviously you started off by asking about the, what the life was like down there. But I think it's also important to stress that there are different potential types of mining going to happen.
Okay.
Now, obviously,
that one then.
Also important to stress, no mining has happened. As Jessica mentioned, we're talking about mining. The exploration licenses have been granted, but outside of some potentially large-scale test mining, no mining has really happened. And also quite important early on, just to stress that there are different regulations effectively between what happens in international waters and what happens in the waters that border countries, often those exclusive economic zones. So at the moment, I mean, obviously all we're talking about at the moment is what's happening in international waters. But just to say, I mean, there are 3 different potential types of mining. One is for what are known as hydrothermal vents, or basically massive sulfides, and really that's sort of underwater volcanoes. At the moment, actively not many people are looking at that, certainly international waters. Also areas called different again on seamounts, which is generally known as cobalt-rich crusts. And again, not so much being done. Most of the focus is on what are known as polymetallic nodules, which are effectively these sort of things that look like metallic lumps of coal that sit on what are known as the abyssal plains. So what's kind of interesting at the moment is there's a little bit of an argument and understand within the International Seabed Authority on what the rules are actually being discussed, because most contractors are looking at polymetallic nodules, but as there's these differences, what are the rules trying to cover? And we're already at this stage still having arguments over whether it's polymetallic nodules, just polymetallic nodule, whether it will cover all different types of mining. And there's also a couple of other potential types of mining, but those are the main 3. So I kind of is worth understanding that. But then I think onto your question, it's hugely important, that question as to why we need deep sea mining. And there's been a long debate in terms of the history of deep sea mining. I mean, it potentially started around the 1970s. There was a kind of initial push for it to happen. It went away again. I would argue it mostly went away again because the prices of metals changed and there was less of an economic reason for it. And it's kind of come back now again, I would argue, partly because the price of metals has increased and therefore there's a little bit more of an incentive to do it. contractors would argue it's also because technologically there have been advances that kind of allow them to do it. But that is the key question: why do it? And obviously, you know, one of the main arguments is it's profitable. Historically, there has been a push to do it quickly, and it's an interesting question as to why that is the case. And you know, we will talk about the ISA with the regulations being finished, and you know, whether they should be rushed or not rushed, or whether there's delays. But that whole, because recently that whole argument around how much of a rush there is based around the narrative that we need these metals for the change, basically climate change, and we need the metals to feed into a just transition. And you know, I think there is a potential argument there, but generally speaking, you know, there are many counter arguments we can make, and we may get into those. But more importantly, what's interesting, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly maybe 5 years, is there's been a shift away from a lot of those arguments and increasingly into arguments for critical minerals. So the arguments now have shifted much more. It's not just because we need these because we are going to go into batteries, which will go into electric vehicles, which will save the world, but that there are needs within geopolitical reasoning that, you know, people need secure supply chains, much of which generally are really practically talking about avoiding supply chains that have China involved in them.
Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about that rush, and in the 1970s there being that rush reason being used, what was the rush then? Because it seems like green technology and the need for it's only really become something in our public consciousness more recently. So what were the initial arguments? How did this all start?
That's a good question. And I mean, there are slightly different versions that are given of it. One of the most interesting versions is around effectively the first kind of key project that was going to happen was funded by the CIA. Because there was a Russian submarine which had sunk. Basically, the CIA, American authorities wanted to get hold of the submarine, but they were worried that if they were moved ships around there, they would it would be known that they were doing this. So Howard Hughes funded various companies, and at the time Lockheed Martin got involved as well to build the materials. And basically, they tried to raise this submarine. Failed, or half failed, sort of half did it. But in a way, that money, I mean, they basically set up a front that involved paying for academics in universities to start working on this. So oddly enough, I would say that the security was sort of involved in the very first argument. So perhaps we've come circular. But I think, you know, there were also arguments at the time. Yeah. There were also arguments at the time, that it was at a time when metal prices were going up. And perhaps the more important question to say is why it kind of went away. Because it's not like the technology went away, but it was literally just sort of disappeared off the agenda because prices changed. I would argue again, there are a few others that may change different. But Jessica, you look like you were going to come in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the security argument, because what is clear is that opening up the deep sea to secure supply chains is not a smart way of securing supply chains, because there are all kinds of choke points around getting the minerals from the deep sea to the shore. That you need to build processing plants that takes many years, and these minerals very often have to go through places where there's conflict. So at the moment we have conflict in one or two big straits in the world, and that is set to hopefully not continue, but that is the world we live in. And so there are many sort of surrounding issues around deep sea mining, which takes the discussion way away from deep sea very quickly and into the other issues around how to get these minerals and how to get them into the products, and do we really need them? We had the pleasure of commissioning a report from the German Institute of Geography and Area Studies, a think tank based in Germany, and which looked into the security aspects around deep sea mining. and looked at the security more broadly than what states maybe think about as security. So look at supply chain security, environmental security, economic security for countries and communities, food security issues, and taken all of those security issues together, it is clear that the deep sea mining is not going to help. It may even aggravate security in writ large, which is really what the governments need to look at.
How much of that was taken in, that kind of argument was taken into the ISA? Was there much discussion around that?
No, not much discussion around that. We brought that into our interventions. We had the report with us at the ISA. We had a side event, which is how civil society can contribute other than statements in the discussions. And the side event, actually, I think it was very good because their delegates come at lunchtime, get something to eat, they can relax a little bit, they listen to the presentation, they can ask questions. And I do think that was very important for at least some delegates to get some other kinds of input into how they think about deep sea mining. I mean, to be honest, it's very few countries who are actually interested in this industry at the moment, and most of the other countries are on the fence, or they are, as you were saying, there are now 46 countries who are calling for a pause or a moratorium. Most of them for the lack of science, but also because there are plenty of parts of the regulations that are being discussed or negotiated that are not at all developed and very far from completion yet. So, that's also a reason for slowing down. And this then, provides yet another area that they can think about, in terms of how they think about the bigger picture around the ocean, a healthy ocean as a safety net, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd actually quite like to zoom back into the ISA a bit and come to you, Lucy. We've got a question from Alan, which is, have private companies always been allowed to participate at the ISA? Is this something that should change? And I know there's been debate over contractors having an observer status, and their current role being able to sit alongside states like Nauru. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about how private companies played a role at the ISA, Lucy?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, again, I'm probably not the most qualified person to answer the question, so I can always pass it back to the other two on the panel, as this was my first year attending. But I mean, from what I understand, so there was an agenda point on this year's assembly sessions about bringing in contractors as observers, and whether or not contractors should have access to be granted observer status, like other non-governmental, intergovernmental organizations. So people like the International Maritime Organization and other IGOs also have access like NGOs do. This was an agenda point that was debated quite at length on one of the days of the assembly sessions and was adjourned for later in the week. And the consensus wasn't reached at first, and there was a bit of a pushback between countries about whether or not this should be the case. And a lot of the NGOs very rightly highlighted that contractors already have access as part of member state delegations, which member states have voting rights, observers don't. It gives them access to informal sessions that are closed to observers, a variety of other reasons. And this kind of just felt like grabbing for more space at the sessions in a way to kind of sway the conversations and negotiations, to me. And I know there was an outcome on Friday afternoon. I wasn't there for Friday afternoon, so I wonder if Becky or Andy, you want to. Sorry, Becky, Jessica. I was looking at a name. I was looking at Becky on the comments as I read that. If you guys wanted to speak about the outcome on Friday, because I know we didn't really get a kind of clear yes or no. It ended up being a bit of a halfway.
I can do that if you would like to. Yeah, and Becky, you seem to know a lot about the ISA already, so that's interesting. So on Friday, the issue of contractors being granted observer status was sort of, I guess, half solved by a decision to give them preliminary observer status, but that there still was going to be discussion around the guidelines for how that observer status was actually going to take place. Because it is actually, I just want to add to what you observers to the ISA or in the UN system are non-for-profit and not for-profit organizations. So IMO is non-for-profit, of course, it's an IGO, WWF and others are also non-for-profit organizations. The contractors who sits as an observer at the ISA, I assume that's the Norwegian one, and they are sort of a contractors and observer slightly in disguise because they organize themselves into a different organization in order to get observer status. Polish, yeah, right, you're right. So the Polish is that's a consortium, has been observer for many years. That's true. And I guess you could say they're a contractor, absolutely right, Becky. But I think they are a little bit different from the companies who are now pushing for mining to start and who have who are actively fundraising and actively working in the way they are. But yes, it is interesting that there is the Inter-Oceanic Metals, I think they called, organization has been there for ages. But again, they are an organization. It's a funny one, that one. I think it is a legacy from the Cold War, even if I'm not correctly.
Nice.
Right, let's have a discussion about that, Becky, because that's something I don't think we have thought too much about, but that's maybe at some other time.
Yeah, and just to return to another question, we've got one from Ben about the key takeaways, and it's looking at mining leases. So what were the key takeaways from the Assembly are the latest announcement from the NOAA and the metals company / Allseas on the deep sea mining lease sale near American Samoa, and the broader risk of unilateral mining going ahead before multilateral regulations are finalised. I might pass this one over to you, Andy. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, again, this is where we come back to that point I made at the start, the difference between what's happening in the ISA, where we're talking about international waters and national waters. So it's important in terms of the US that the executive order that was made last year by President Trump, which was about promoting deep sea mining, both promoted the idea that the US could work unilaterally, so effectively to mine on their own in the international waters, because they're not a signatory of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is their argument, and they can do it under freedom of the high seas, but also in their own waters. So they are also pursuing mining in their own waters through two separate entities. So within the US, NOAA is doing the international, and BOEM is doing the national permitting. So it's still, both are still in terms of exploration, and obviously both are happening under their own processes. In terms of, it's always going to be very difficult, and it has been historically for some time, in terms of what will happen first. Will countries mine in their own territorial waters, in their own EEZs, or will it happen internationally? I think a lot of countries in general have tried to hold back and wait for the mining codes to be finished, because then you have what would effectively be a gold standard if you've got to implement your own rules, regulations. That's not the case in the US, where they historically have their own regulations, and Lucy could probably speak to that maybe a bit more. But yeah, I think it's still going to take time. I think during the ISA meeting, the issue of unilateral mining came up. The US were keen to stress that they haven't given any exploitation permits out yet. They're still saying that this hasn't moved forward. So it's going to be interesting. I mean, basically we come back to that question as to kind of whether is the ISA being slow in coming out with these rules? Because the argument for unilateral mining, that the contractors who've wanted to leave the ISA to in fact parallel work with the ISA and with the US licenses in the case of the metals company, is that the ISA has taken too long, that there have been delays, that it's just it's not fit for purpose, and therefore they can go elsewhere much more quickly. I would say that that's kind of, that's a little bit ridiculous. I mean, there is a kind of caveat emptor thing. I think if you've started off with the idea that you want to do an international license, you have signed up to the idea that you're going to be subject to the ISA and the regulations that are being negotiated, which are incredibly complex. And we can come back to the bits that haven't been done. But, it's an international institution that is trying to negotiate rules for mining, which is a very complex thing to do. And mining in international waters, which also have to benefit all of humankind. So you have to have economic aspects in there as well as the environmental protection. So I would say they're really going to take a long time anyway. They're going to take as long as they take. And if we do them well, then they're going to take quite a lot of time. So I come back to that. So it's sort of like a very mixed answer to that. But basically, we should be waiting for the rules to be negotiated generally. Obviously, it's up to countries themselves in their own exclusive economic zones what they do. But the key issue is you shouldn't necessarily be using the fact that it is taking a reasonable amount of time, I would say, to get the regulations done to justify finding a way around that, a workaround for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And we've actually got so many questions. It's a really obviously fruitful discussion. It's almost overwhelming, but we've got one coming in from Shersho, who said, if the ISE does agree to a moratorium, how can it ensure companies like the metals company do not bypass the ISA and start deep sea mining in the area? So what kind of power does the ISA really have, I guess, internationally over stopping mining? And Becky said the ISA can't agree to a moratorium, but if a moratorium is put in place, how do we ensure it's upheld, I guess, is maybe the thrust of the question.
Yeah, I think they're slightly, I guess I'll come back to that. I mean, others may well critically want to. I mean, I think it's a slightly separate thing to whether there's a moratorium or not, but to the question that what happens if the metals company goes ahead. And I think there are two answers to that. I mean, one of the issues that came up was discussed in the current assembly was around an opinion that's been asked of it, loss of the tribunal, to see what can be done. There was further discussion on that, and that got kind of kicked into the long grass a bit. So they will come back to look at it in the next ISA assembly meeting. So and I think there are discussions going on in the meantime and effectively it's around sorting out the question, making sure that there is clarity in what the question will be, which is obviously going to be very important if you're asking a tribunal. But in the meantime, I think there are arguments that countries, any country effectively that has a partner of a company that wants to mine in international waters, unilaterally, that country has an obligation to hold those corporate partners to account. So, and that's basically under Articles 137 and 139, which is of UNCLOS. And so I think it's going to be interesting. We've already seen, debates or questions raised in Swiss Parliament with regards to Allseas, who are a Swiss-Dutch business partner, and again from Dutch politicians. So I think again it's a moving feast because all of this is happening quite quickly. But I think relatively rapidly, I think countries are going to be called upon to develop. In some cases, there are laws already there, but if not, to develop laws that will hold citizens and companies who are partners of those companies who are doing unilateral mining to account.
Yeah, I think that'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out. And to just kind of take a step back here, and Lucy, this is your first time attending the ISA meeting, and obviously you work in the rights of nature and earth law, and we've talked a lot about the commercial interest, we talked a lot about international frameworks. So how does earth law fit into this discussion, and how can it help, or how could it help protect our deep sea ecosystems, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant question. This is a lot of what we're trying to figure out at this stage. We're working through what these questions look like and how we can be most useful in this space, because as I say, we're kind of the new kids on the block here. And I think, I think the most important thing really to focus on is that it felt very interesting to me, the representation of voices within the assembly and within these negotiations, and especially when we're thinking about how we frame these conversations, because see, the mandate of the ISA is to create a mining code, and this was consistently referred back to throughout the assembly sessions, talking about the mandate, talking about getting the mining code over the line, especially with the pressure from Nauru invoking the 2-year rule. And how that's, we've already passed that by quite a significant amount now. And, there was a quite strong intervention from Nauru in the middle of the assembly sessions, that referenced that. And there was this kind of common focus about the area, so the area for mining in international waters being common heritage of humankind. And obviously that's a massive focus for developing states in terms of like how the area will be managed going forward. We had a lot of really beautiful inclusion of Indigenous voices at this assembly. And so that was through organizations and groups that, are kind of headed by Indigenous peoples, and also Indigenous peoples who are given a space to speak by other groups. So a partner of ours, TBA 21, gave space to Indigenous groups from Jamaica to speak at the sessions, and to kind of, I felt in that moment when that happened, it was a real shift in the tone of the conversation, and that we'd been kind of in one flow of conversation where we've been talking about extraction, and then it did kind of shift. And I think that is what really matters. I think it's important to make sure that when we're talking about, rights-based approaches and inclusion of diverse voices, that this is done in a way that's fruitful to ongoing efforts, because, people have been, you can see Andy sat here, and everyone who's been involved around with the DSCC, who's been involved in these negotiations for such a long time, and especially as we come into a place where multilateralism in general is being threatened, want to make sure that all actions are effective and positive for moving us in the right direction. But I think that was really important in kind of shifting how we're having this conversation, because, the mandate of the ISA being to develop a mining code, but yet we have, I think it's 46 countries now, or maybe 47, I think 46, calling for a precautionary pause or a moratorium. Which obviously kind of goes against the inherent mandate, but we've written these laws into being, and what is to say that we can't shift that going forward? And it was actually brought up in the sessions, the IWC, as a kind of example of how mandates have changed like this before. So obviously the International Whaling Commission having the its mandate being for to regulate whaling as a commercial industry, and then shifting towards a moratorium position through member state pressure. So I think that's, for me, is what is really interesting to think about in this space, how we can drive forward towards that as an option. I see, Jessica, that it looks like you really want to jump in there as well.
When you're done, Yeah, just to say that I agree with everything you said, but the ISA has a dual mandate. It has the mandate to develop, steward minerals activities on the seafloor in the international waters, and to protect the marine environment from adverse impacts from these activities. So that's really, really important. And it is, at this stage, an impossible task, because you cannot manage what you cannot, when you cannot measure. And so, because the science isn't there, as I was talking about in the beginning, you can't set baselines, which means that you cannot actually measure the impact of such an industry should it start before we have the science. So it's almost like a circular argument, but that is sort of part of why we are in this situation with the ISA as well. And I think one of the issues is that the ISA is taking, well, member states, and actually also the Secretariat, is taking its mandate to facilitate mining, if you wish, more seriously, or putting that to the fore rather than the protection of the marine environment. So that's sort of part of the conundrum here amongst everything else. I love your parallel to the IWC.
Maybe I can put forward this question from Becky then, which is that Sam's recently voted the ocean as a member of their board. Do you think the ISA could do something similar to represent nature? Would that help? These seem like really intense geopolitical discussions. How do we get nature to be part of the conversation as it should be, really?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. I mean, so at our Floor Centre, we've done a lot of work in nature conscious corporate governance historically, and that was actually my focus for a while at our Floor Centre, in terms of how do we bring nature's voice into corporate governance and decision making, and what does that look like in these kind of complex governance spaces. And this is ongoing work, and it's definitely not something that happens overnight. It's something that requires a lot of careful consideration and careful implementation on a very kind of on a real one-to-one basis to make sure that implementation is really effective, and that's what's really important. So the translation of these like kind of frameworks off the cuff is just not, that's not something that I think needs to be explored right now or should be explored right now, especially in terms of like having the ocean represented kind of in one way or another. I think what does need to be explored is how these diverse voices can be represented more institutionally, more openly, and make that more not a kind of like out of left field part of these negotiations, and have that something that's accepted as this is a very important piece of these negotiations and considerations to take into account. So we're exploring with a couple of partners about what this could look like going forward in different consultation spaces, and how we do that in a way that's really effective to ongoing efforts that have been ongoing for a really long time, kind of using practices and principles from other spaces where we've seen really great effect. And kind of conscious governance is something that I'm trying to draw from, and like how you create, how you incorporate nature's voices into these quite complex and very mechanistic decision-making spaces, and how you do that in a way that's not inflammatory and ineffective, but in a way that really moves us towards the goals that we want to achieve. So something that's definitely we're working on in practice, but it's not an easy to answer question by any sense of the imagination.
Exciting challenge, perhaps. I'm also interested in this parallel then between, as you were talking about, Jessica, the lack of scientific knowledge of what's going on in these deep ecosystems. And Andy, we've covered in our newsroom some of the reports you've done about the financial viability of these industries, particularly one report which found from the deep sea, the metals company's own pre-feasibility study that the mining wouldn't be financially viable. Can you talk to us a bit more about the financial reason, all of the financial benefits that companies gain from deep sea mining, if there is some, and if it seems risky, then why are they still pursuing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it's good to compare it from two sides. One is from the companies and investors, and the other is from what governments will get, because I think that's increasingly coming up at the ISA now. In terms of companies, you say we've done a report, a couple of reports really, but most recently a guy called Steve Emmerman, who is a very noted expert in terms of critiquing various feasibility studies from mining companies and looking at environmental and economic issues. And he joined a number of different organizations who've done this in the past, is to pull apart the pre-feasibility study that the metals company did. And he, as well as various other studies I could point to, but I'll probably drop the link to his report in, basically found that the only way the figures add up is based on the fact that the company has been very over-optimistic on what money they might get back from sales, but also underestimating costs. And particularly, and I think it's really, really key, an issue around this key factor where you base everything called a discount rate. And the discount rate is, if you're an investor, you assume that if you have the safest place you can invest money, you're going to make interest on it. So so the sort of base discount rate is 5%, because that's the idea that if you invest in treasury bonds, you'll get 5% back. So the sort of lowest level, and then you work backwards and you start putting in all the extra risks. Now, the metals company have come up with and again, we're going back to them because they're one of the few people that have even got as far as a pre-feasibility study, which is an early level of it. They've put in this 8%, and 8% is, that's lower than most mining companies. It's around the very lowest level that a standard mining company that has all its permits in place, that isn't starting up a completely new industry. So the level of risk is just fantastically underestimated. And I think that's the key point. And I think, increasingly I work with investors, financiers, and now, when we produced a report recently that tried to summarize investor concern, and I think it's 39 investors have a policy now against deep sea mining,
Wow.
82 express some form of concern. And most of this is, is because I think they see these potential risks, the high level of environmental risk, reputational risk, but also just, it doesn't add up. So, why do the companies keep going? I mean, I think that's because it's just a little bit like the rising balloon conundrum. Once you're there, you're in there, you keep going. But also, it's quite feasible for people to make money, whether deep sea mining happens or not. I mean, in mining, there's this long history of speculation, effectively, as someone just getting a lease somewhere, making money. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in the US, particularly in national waters at the moment. There's been a rush of about 8 new companies come in who are all just sort of like one man and a website. So you can make this speculative money fairly easily, and mining doesn't have to happen. And then the last thing just to say is that I think it's really fascinating that for countries, it's really starting to come up. Because again, all of this has been quite theoretical. And now the mining code has got on to looking at, how you redistribute any extra money that's around to try and ensure the common benefits of humankind, which you're meant to do if you're mining international waters, but also separately to compensate countries where the mineral price might go down if deep sea mining suddenly starts producing. So you've got all of these things, and they're suddenly beginning to realize that the pot of money could be absolutely terribly small to non-existent. So it's kind of interesting that we're kind of hitting this buffer at the moment. But anyway, happy to take more questions on that.
Yeah, well, we're unfortunately already over time, which is really annoying because I think there is so much to unpack here. No. So I'll just finish on one question for each of you, but hopefully we can do this again and come back and revisit, because it's such a rich topic with so many different angles we can take on it, and everyone's so engaged in the chat that it seems such a shame to be winding up, but I'm super conscious of time. I wondered if I could go around to each of you and if you could give something, direct our readers or attendees to one part of this story, to one part of the deep sea mining debate that you think people should be aware of or will find interesting or even find hope in, so they can go forward. And then next time we have one of these sessions, they can bring those questions forward. I'll go with you first, Lucy.
I mean, something that's really interesting, and I think, we're seeing unfold right now, is what the kind of, it feels like almost like a microcosm and like a battleground for protecting multilateralism. And I found that very interesting to watch play out. And so I think it's quite important to, and that was restated so many times throughout the sessions by country delegates. So I think that it's important for us to kind of rally behind this concept of multilateralism, so we can kind of protect that, what that means on the international stage with, ongoing negotiations, but also try and set some precedent for how we can make this more balanced and how we can kind of ensure that corporate interests don't override what the rest of the planet wants and needs in not just this space, but others as well going forward, with the BBNJ COP1 coming up and other climate negotiations going forward too. Obviously, COP in Armenia coming up this autumn as well.
That's an interesting one. I thought you were going to go more rights and nature oriented, so I'm intrigued. I'll be following up on that with you. And Jessica, if I come to you, what's one thing that our audience could take away from this, look more into, find interesting or hopeful?
I think that it's really important to realize that this debate, even though it is about deep sea mining, is actually about how we use resources more globally in our economies. And I think it's very, very important to think about how we can make sure that we have a much more circular economy, and that is obviously for many other resources and minerals. And so I think that's a space which needs to be investigated a lot more. Many organizations are looking into that. WWF issued a report that was commissioned by us a few years ago with scenarios on how we can turn the mineral economy into a circular economy and still achieve the green transition and not open new mines on land or in the sea. So I think that is a really, really important way to look at it and to have a little bit of a positive outlook, because otherwise, I think it is easy to sort of get bogged down and get depressed with the politics and the guff around this. Thank you.
That's a good one. And coming to you, Andy, to finish, what would yours be?
I mean, again, I've kind of already talked a lot bit to the finance side, which is my main side. But I guess, I mean, what's kind of interesting now, I think, is just there's just so many layers of complexity coming in at the moment. We could probably do with a second session, because it's just between that national, between the international. I think we're now moving, and we mentioned the legal challenges that are kind of coming up. So I think it's fascinating, and it's really difficult that we need to step back. I mean, we talked about that call for a moratorium, but there was a really good article I read recently from an academic who kind of said that the ISA situation was a little bit like Macbeth, and the fact that the witches had kind of predicted Macbeth's rise, and therefore everything's driven forward by prophecy. And actually, it's a little bit like once the ISA is set up, that once it considers its mandate mainly to be about mining, that we're driving forward to that. But actually, that's not the case. We can take the step back, and so I think it would be that's the point. I think now in this time of complexity to try and step back for that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time. It has been super interesting talking to you, and thank you everyone for all your questions and insights. We will have a second part of this. I think we've got to. There's so many more unanswered questions. Each of those three different angles you guys said there would be really interesting to look into more. And you can join this roundtable discussion again. We have them every Tuesday at 4 p.m. on the same link that lands in your inbox. And just keep an eye if you're looking for the deep sea mining one or any of our other interesting ones for it, and you can join. We've got a 30% off offer if you've enjoyed this discussion and if you want to see more about what Oceanographic does as a magazine, as a media brand. And yeah, thank you all for your time. Hopefully see you again next week, same time, same place, same link. And thanks for joining. Thanks, guys.